on activism and art in the Third and Fifth Republics. I am Daniel Sherman. I will be your chair this afternoon, but I had nothing to do with organizing this panel. All the glory goes to our first speaker, Jonathyne Briggs. Jonathyne is Professor of History and Associate Dean of Humanities and Arts at Indiana University Northwest. My commiserations. He is the author of Sounds French, Globalization, Cultural Communities, and Pop Music in France, 1958 to 1980, published by Oxford in 2015, and Perpetual Children, The Politics of Autism in France since 1950, forthcoming in Oxford's New Histories of Psychology series next year. He is published in French Historical Studies, French Politics, Culture and Society, and Modern Intellectual History, among others. His article, From Collaboration to Resistance, The Family Dynamic in Autism Literature in Contemporary France, which appeared in Contemporary European History in 2022, received an Outstanding Article Award from the Disability History Association. I should also note that he has performed yeoman service for this association, notably as secretary, which I think is the jack of all trades who keeps everything running before, during, and after conferences, and for the French history community over the years. His talk today is entitled Sonic Protest, Music Therapy and Self-Expression as Forms of Autistic Activism.
For coming on a lovely Saturday afternoon. I feel so blessed here. So this piece, by the way, is something that was sort of on the cutting room floor of the manuscript that I wasn't quite sure what to do with, so I'm very open to any ideas that you might have about it and directions that I might take it or put it back into the bin, as it will, right? So, on March 7th, 2003, the Sonic Protest Music Festival had its inaugural event, featuring avant-garde musicians from France and beyond, whose works emphasize drone, noise, and other forms of electroacoustic contemporary composition. One of the groups performing, a band Renault, was led by Miguel Thomason, a drummer and vocalist for the Argentinian band. Thomason has Down syndrome, and his work with the group led to his advocacy for creative opportunities for disabled and neurodivergent musicians. As part of his efforts, Thomason met with patients at the Hôpital du Jour d'Antony, a therapeutic center for autists, for a workshop housed at the center. The workshop was the Atelier Radio et Musique, or ARM, as I'm going to much more easily call it going forward. The workshop provided opportunities for the patients at the Hôpital to learn musical instruments, not as a form of therapy, but rather as one of self-expression for autistic individuals who had historically been marginalized within art worlds. The success of Thomason's band and its inclusion at the festival suggested possibilities for other groups to develop their own aesthetic and to find audiences for their music despite the social barriers of disability. The music that emerged from this inspiration, the group Les Aris, or the Harrys, I guess, was defined by atonality, improvisation, and lyrical concerns that operated far beyond the conventions of popular music. Les Aris created a droning, repetitive sound in their music, which was collected in the 2015 recording Gogo, released by the Sonic Protest label associated with the festival. Richard Foster, in his glowing review of the album, stated, quote, "Every now and then, you get a record that has the ability to stop time in its tracks, one informed by another form of intelligence that demands your full attention," end quote. Les Aris output since 2003 represents a form of what I would argue is action culturelle, the effort for all French people to participate in cultural life, as it serves also as an example of how developmentally disabled people had contributions to make to music. Moreover, it also emphasizes the genre, of outsider music, which itself has connections to French artistic history and could potentially be viewed as an expression of what's known as an autistic aesthetic. In this paper, I will outline how the activities of Les Aris operated within the context of the emergence of the self-advocacy movement in France during the 21st century, and how it signifies something outside the boundaries of debates concerning autism in France that points to pathways for acceptance and integration for autists. Outsider music emerged in the 1990s as a catch-all term for defining music that defied categorization. Erwin Schused notes the connections between outsider music and outsider art, and a kind of earlier form, or an earlier term, that emerged as a topic of interest due to the work of asylum patients in the 19th century, and leading to the French celebrating it as what they called art brut, beginning in the 1940s. Art brut was a category devised by Jean Dubuffet in 1944, and his approach to identifying examples relied heavily upon a conception of cognitive disability that emphasized the detachment of disabled arts from cultural influence, and instead was an expression of a form of artistic purity. Right? The metaphorical understanding of autism as a form of social detachment became a method of explaining the aesthetics of art brut, or outsider art as it had been translated. And Dubuffet's response was built upon his reflection of works completed in Swiss asylums. While Dubuffet conceptualized art brut through visual arts, the notion of outsider art encompasses all forms of art, including music, but implied a form of marginalization that often reified the position of disabled people as outside of both society and culture. Another connection between music and disability was the development of art therapy, which became more systemic in the middle of the 20th century, and as an extension, music therapy, which also has a longer history as a form of treatment. The first one is more active, with creativity and physical engagement as a key element of the process, and the second one is more passive, with consumption of music as a method of transforming physical and emotional states as a form of medicine. Art therapy became more organized as a clinical intervention for physically and cognitively disabled people after the publication of Adrian Hill's Art versus Illness in 1945 Britain. In the post-war period, music therapy was increasingly associated with the composition and performance of music as a method of treatment, leading to the recognition of outsider music as a musical genre. However, in the context of music therapy, it was understood as a form of rehabilitation that often affirmed social norms and conformity as a method of identifying deficiencies in a patient, rather than as a form of artistic expression of the patient. Right? While the concept of outsider music does not presuppose disability, many outsider musicians that came to prominence in the 20th century were also neurodivergent or considered mentally disabled. Some of the most heralded examples in American popular music, Daniel Johnson, Wesley Willis from my hometown of Chicago, and Wildman Fisher, have all been diagnosed as disabled. The popular music boom of the 1960s and the development of inexpensive recording technology allowed for the capture of more and more of these artists, and musicians who operated on the edges of convention often championed them in the manner that Dubuffet had for visual outsider artists previously. Much like the notion of outsider art as a manifestation of purity, outsider music implied a rejection of the commercial and aesthetic conventions of popular music as an inherent sign of its artistic value. These artists operated outside the politics of disability that became increasingly visible after 1968, with activists seeking to create disabled art that articulated the experience of disabled people. This type of self-conscious nature of disability art distinguishes it from the more audience-defined meaning of outsider music. And by the way, it suggests a vital difference in the intention. So, the establishment of the Hôpital du Jour d'Antony in France was important in exploring these various meanings of outsider music and disability aesthetics, and the relationship between the two within a therapeutic setting. The day clinic emphasized the importance of art practices as a form of therapeutic engagement with patients at the facility, and as a recognition of the creative capabilities of autistic people at the clinic. The facility developed the Atelier Papillon in the late 1980s, which led to the publication of the journal Papillon, which was produced by the young people in the workshop in collaboration with Dr. Moise Assouline and Howard Boutin. Assouline, a psychiatrist, and Boutin, an artist, he was actually a mime, interestingly enough, understood the importance of creativity and self-expression as a form of social engagement for autistic people who had been marginalized in French society. While the visual arts and creative writing had been the initial focus of the atelier, the performing arts became an equal element in the 1990s. Boutin rejected the notion of existent forms of intervention for autists as forms of what he saw as social conditioning and the reinforcement of social norms, and believed instead that the arts provided the basis for meaningful dialogue about the autistic experience. And yet, art therapy had a very different intervention for therapists as a method of rehabilitation that still emphasized normative behaviors as the desired outcome. The need for social conformity as part of the socialization of disabled populations suggested how art therapy reinforced social norms as a goal rather than allowing individuals to explore self-expression freely. However, at the Hôpital, the staff rejected that position and spoke instead about how the historical practice of art therapy was still based on notions of isolation and removal from society. It was neither artistic nor therapeutic, as it did not recognize the disabled individual's right to artistic self-expression. For example, the art of disabled people was historically confiscated by therapists, which had allowed Dubuffet access to this type of art in the first place in the 1940s. The atelier emphasized the right of self-expression as a critical element of autistic people's engagement with French society. At the same time, Le Pépotin, as a mouthpiece for the community at the clinic, was not just interested in the arts, but also in political engagement. Yet the need for artistic expression was couched in terms that emphasized the political valence of their actions as a method of rejecting stereotypes concerning autistic people through written, visual, and performing arts, which led to the publication of Le Pépotin as an ongoing magazine in 1990. It's still in publication, by the way, today. Fascinating. I would encourage you all to pick up a copy whenever you can. Composing and performing music were critical to the advocacy at the Hôpital, leading to the establishment of the ARM as both a method of cultural action and as a way of improving the lives of young people at the clinic. Encouraged by support from Alain Cortis, who was another member of Renault, the Atelier refused to impose the ideas of practicing musicians and instead allowed for broad musical exploration. Led by a combination of musicians, educators, and psychologists, the ARM participated in the Sonic Protest Festival through the formation of a group in 2013, Les Aris, consisting of 6 autistic people, Sam, David, Alexandre, Nicolas, Quentin, and Jérôme, who performed on a variety of instruments in a style of music that was a combination of pop music, chanting, free jazz, and musique concrète, sometimes all together at once. It's fascinating. This music represented how these young musicians were not closed off from society, but rather that they often focused on elements of culture that were ignored by neurotypical people. Les Aris played on a combination of traditional instruments, guitars, accordions, synthesizers. It's weird to think of a synthesizer as a traditional instrument, but they also played on these constructed instruments that created a sound more in line with the avant-garde approach of the groups who were affiliated with the Sonic Protest Festival. The group recorded an album, Gigot, in 2015 that contained 31 tracks with contributions from every member on vocals and instruments. The songs vary in style and approach, often dictated by the singer's influence. So for example, on C'est la voix, the song is basically a repetition of this title for about 4 minutes. That approaches discord and atonality, but it never really quite manages to fall apart. It's still a song in some way. The album is also interspersed with short, what they call jingle tracks that mimic the tonality of advertising, while other songs explore the style of Kumsch rock, or what we used to call krautrock. That's kind of a problematic term, but it kind of gives you the idea of what it is. It's associated with 1970s West German groups such as Can, Faust, and Cluster. The lyrics were a combination of observations about the quotidian experience of the group and their perceptions of society. With little segging between the tracks, the album often shifts abruptly in style from one song to the next. This is not one to listen to while you're trying to fall asleep. And with each vocalist offering a very different vocal texture and style to expand the sound of the band. In his review of the record for The Quietists, Richard Foster remarked about how the group operated outside of commercial expectation and musical conventions in a way that challenges the listener. Although he also noted how Guigaud brought up the issues of consuming outsider music. He asked, is this exploitative or voyeuristic? What purpose does this music serve? These questions emerge from the subjectivity of the artist, in this case, developmentally disabled musicians, rather than the music itself, right? So if this music had been created by a neurotypical person, these aren't typically the questions you would ask them. At least as Foster argues. Rather, Guigaud suggests a value of outsider art not as a curiosity, but as a place of exploration. As outsider art exists in contrast, or maybe better put, in dialogue with musical conventions of composition and performance, Foster asserted that Guigaud is something else entirely. So in the end, he came to reject this position of voyeurism. So, is the music of Les Aries expressive of outsider art, or is it a form of autistic art? In comparison to other examples, such as the Wild Classical Music Ensemble in the Benelux countries, the Artism Ensemble in the United States, or the Otasabi Project in Japan, these are all other autistic ensembles. The work of Les Aries suggests that the combination of free improvisation and repetition that involves the sharing of compositional duties across a collective signifies a type of autistic expression. Ethnomusicologist Michael Bacon notes that the stereotypes of autistic individuals as rigid and inflexible are often challenged in their musical expression, which shows their ability to improvise and interact. Within the brittle framework of improvisation, individuals can negotiate not only their contributions to the collective work, but also their differences from each other and the audience. And as in the case of the Otabi Project, the difference between the audience and the performer is actually quite often unclear, as participation in musical creation is often open. So Les Aries would invite people to come up on stage and bang a can or whatever. This is very, so in some ways it would act as we might think of like performance art, right? Okay. Les Aries toured and supported this album, playing shows in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands to audiences interested in the music of groups associated with the Sonic Protest Festival. So they became kind of affiliated with this style of music. In a short documentary that followed the group on its 2016 tour, Les Aries performed in Le Mans, while also being shown walking through the town and preparing for the show. What the film reveals is that the lives of these young men are like those of other touring musicians. You know, they're concerned about the same thing. What's for dinner? What's the next show? How long are we going to be in this van? You know, it's just like a hardcore group in the 1980s. And that with accommodation and acceptance, they've found a place to share their art in French society, even if it's not in the cultural mainstream. The process of recording and performing provided a path for these young men to integrate through cultural expression. While the outcome might echo the idealized goal of art therapy, right, the integration of individuals into a society, the praxis lacked the aspect of conformity often associated with it. Instead, we have expressions of a form of autistic art that further challenge assumptions concerning disabled people. So Les Aries were not alone in the development of an autistic sound, as another group from the Institut Médico-Éducatif in Bourg-la-Reine, this is the group Astérotypie, developed out of a workshop there in 2010. While Les Aries were part of the experimental music scene in France, Astérotypie have a more mainstream rock sound that led to their integration in the broader music world, including a recent performance a few weeks ago, well, actually not now it was a couple months ago, at the Roxanne festival. I don't know if any of you have managed to catch a show at Roxanne. Huge, huge festival. They performed there in August of 2024. Interestingly enough, they actually released their album last week, their newest album. There's fantastic songs on it. They're also affiliated with Le Peplotin. Astérotypie have brought further awareness of autistic art and creativity to French audiences while demanding attention for its work from critics. Each of these groups illustrate how forms of autistic self-expression challenge the entrenched assumptions about autistic people in France and can be seen as an extension of the self-advocacy movement that emerged in 2010s in the field of popular music. Rather than outsiders making outsider music, they have positioned themselves as touring musicians who are finding an audience despite presenting challenging music. Through self-expression, these bands are claiming a space for autistic people as equal contributors to both art and society without the need to conform. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Our next speaker, Roxanne Panchasi, is Associate Professor of History at Simon Fraser University, where she's taught since 2002, and recovering former associate dean. Her first book, Future Tense, The Culture of Anticipation in France Between the World Wars, was published by Cornell University Press in 2009. Her articles have been published in Differences, History of the Present, the Routledge Handbook of French History, and Apocalyptica, the Journal of Apocalyptic and Post-Apocalyptic Studies, which I imagine is experiencing a massive increase in circulation at the moment. And she's a regular contributor to Fiction and Film for Scholars of France and other online forums. On the website of one of our sister societies, the Society for the Study of French History, she and Venus Bivar recently posted a reflection on the Netflix film Sous la Seine with the title, and you kind of need to see it in print, but The Reckoning. Netflix's Sous la Seine and the Age of Human Disaster. She's also well known to most of us, I think, as the longtime host of the podcast New Books in French Studies, which is a huge service to the profession and makes her, I think, without doubt, the best read modern French historian. And she's been working for some time on French nuclear imperialism. Her talk today is The Work of Art in the Age of French Nuclear Imperial Destruction.
Can I sit? Is that okay with you all? Just because the laptop sort of slides, and I'll just move over when there's an image up here, but I don't think I'll get in the way of it too much. Thank you, Dan, for that great introduction. Thanks to Jonathan for organizing us, and thanks to Nikki for coming here. We live in the same city, but we have to come to San Francisco to meet in person. Very glad to know you. Okay, I'll just get started. I'm not going to be silent the entire time. I'll talk in a minute. So where I live and work, these sorts of acknowledgements have become a best practice and a commonplace. And over the years, my own relationship to acknowledging in this way has changed in terms of the connections I see between my home, my personal and family stories, and the research and teaching that I do. The history and legacies of imperial violence in the spaces local to me as a settler, the child of Muslim South Asian immigrants who were born during the final years of the so-called British India, shapes how I think about the French past, and the lines of awareness and attentiveness move in both directions, or at least I hope they do. And I usually say this sort of thing or show this sort of thing at the beginning of a presentation, but hopefully I'll come back around to it when I'm talking about some of the artists I'll talk about today, just in terms of that distant relationship to a past that's connected through other things. That will make more sense later, I hope. So as some of you already know, over the past several years, I've been working on different aspects of the history of the French bomb, moving in too many analytic directions and drawing on a range of sources from military and diplomatic documents to journalism, literature, film, and music. The larger project is a cultural and political archaeology of representations of nuclear weapons in France and empire since 1945. My research thus far, I was going to do like the whole bomb, and I got stuck in Algeria, happily in some ways. My research thus far has focused on on the period that began with France's first experimental nuclear detonation in Algeria. Jaboise Bleu, a bomb with a yield of 70 kilotons, so about 4 times the Hiroshima bomb, near the village of Regan, about 1,200 kilometers from Algiers in the Sahara Desert on February 13th, 1960. After that first, sorry, the hotel is asking me if I want the Wi-Fi. I do not. After that first French detonation came Jaboise Blanche, detonated in April 1960, Jaboise Rouge detonated in December 1960, and Jaboise Verte in April 1961. So those were the 4 atmospheric detonations. Following these initial aerial explosions, France detonated 13 more bombs underground, 11 of these on the other side of Algeria's independence in July 1962. The French nuclear weapons program then moved to Maui Nui, or French Polynesia so-called, in 1966, and detonations above and beneath the atolls of the Pacific continued with some interruptions until 1996. Over the years that I've worked on this project, that history has become more familiar to a general public, but I'm going to give you that preamble background anyway. It used to be that many people had no idea what I was talking about when I'd start talking about this, but I think you all probably are familiar with this history and more familiar with this history now. And this program continued with some interruptions, as I say, until 1996. In total, 210 major detonations altogether over more than 3 decades. And there were also several other smaller and less official detonations of nuclear packages and devices, plutonium experiments, and others as well over that 36-year period. And I'll just show this handy infographic that I don't have to translate for an audience of historians of France and the Francophone world. I find this image at once extremely useful and sort of devastating, not just for its content, but for the, I mean, I have a whole other thing that I could get into about infographics, but just the distance from the bodies, lives, and landscapes harmed by the complex history it seeks to make clear and legible. Seeing in this way is helpful as we attempt to explain or understand what happened. It also offers nothing like understanding when it comes to critical aspects of this history and what continues to happen, those that defy explanation. The nuclear uncanny rides and slips from borderlines between spectacle and secret, past and present, event and being, seen and unseen. Every body in this room, every one of our bodies, bears the traces of the French and other US, Soviet, UK, Chinese, etc. nuclear detonations conducted since 1945. We have them in our bones and in our teeth. Over 2,000 of them. The temporalities and spaces of radioactivity are long and wide. Colonialism, memory, radiation. These things take their time. These things take their time and have little respect for the political borders set as boundaries between peoples and their histories. In addition to victims who were directly exposed to radiation from the nuclear detonations in Algeria between 1960 and 1966, and whose families have lived their intergenerational physical and psychological effects, France's nuclear-imperial history persists to this day in the form of the radioactive waste left behind when it abandoned the Regan and Einacker nuclear sites in the Sahara after 1967. The desert became a burial ground for the remnants of the enormous infrastructure the French had built there, tools, building fragments, and materials. The Hilton really, okay. Building fragments and materials, military vehicles, and other equipment. And I'll just show this image of the gate, one of the gates at the, I believe this one's at the Einacker site, further south in the Sahara. Just some contemporary, more recent photographs of the sites. This one's kind of hard to see, so there's one of the things that I find interesting is some of the archival images, the black and white and the way it kind of plays with the desert and the sky, but I'll talk about that later. The figure in the suit, and then this kind of debris left over from one of the detonations. Entire, like, massive structures that remain in the desert to this day, and then this image here of a local man kind of overseeing the debris that exists to this day in the Sahara on and near the sites. And they've been scavenged, and people have, taken radioactive materials into their homes and well beyond the region. Seeking the release of archives indicating the precise locations of this contaminated waste, organizations such as the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons and the French Observatoire des Armements have been petitioning for years for the French government and military to share what they know and to acknowledge and engage in meaningful reparations with respect to this ongoing environmental pollution and injustice. This has included calls for France to repatriate its discarded nuclear waste in the Sahara, a material and moral return to be initiated by a sender willing to assume responsibility for its crimes. The contemporary cultural and political remainders of this toxic history have been crucial to my thinking and writing about this past for several years. In some ways, I've become more a historian of the memory of the tests than I am of the tests themselves in some ways, the tests so-called. This has included political, legal, and media representations of the detonations and their lasting impact. It's taken me back through archival photography and film to the then and now imbrication of nuclear and audiovisual technologies. And it's brought me to a number of art and artists, hence my participation in this panel here, who've taken up this past and present in their own work. I found these works inspiring and exciting in myriad ways, difficult, but exciting, as aesthetic projects, as affective provocations, and as expressions of history and memory, creative forms of public pedagogy and a kind of activism in some cases. So what I'd like to do here today is share the work, it's a bit of a show and tell, folks. What I'd like to do here today is share the work of three contemporary artists, the musician and photographer Grégory Dargent, the multimedia artist Heba Amin, and filmmakers Awa Aburawa and Tarab Shah, all of whom have made the Saharan detonations and their legacies the focus of major projects. I've been thinking about and with these projects for some time, considering them individually and working through what makes them a kind of set, if anything, and I kind of want your help with that, thinking about them today. So in addition to tracking and learning as much as I can about the work, I've conducted in-depth interviews with all of these artists, and I have plans to write about them separately and together, and I'm really just at the beginning of thinking through how to pull it all together. So you're sort of test subjects of mine, I guess. Before I get into that work, I want to say a few words about two significant figures I won't be spending time on, but who need acknowledging: the late Algerian painter Lazare Houkar and the Tuareg poet and artist Hawad. And I wanted to show so many examples of their works, but Lazare Houkar, a well-known Algerian painter who died in 2013, Houkar produced a series of about 20 works that revisited and testified to the suffering of Algerian civilians as the real and lasting price of the French bomb in the Sahara, regularly characterized as Algeria's painter of memory. Houkar understood this work as a memorial obligation, a sort of obligation of Algerian citizenship and to Algerian history, and a post-colonial denunciation of the injustices and hypocrisy of a French Western democratic society's exploitation and destruction of his home and the lives of thousands of his compatriots. And this is just one example, Regagne afin que nul n'oublie. I mean, what I just said about his work and the kind of mission of his work is sort of in the title of the piece. And he did a number of pieces using different size figures, often in this kind of three-part, like something going on in the, like either in terms of color in the top third of the painting and then something, this is the form of the mushroom cloud, but, and often with multiple figures sort of buried or just clamoring in the bottom of the image. And there's a series of multiple larger images, larger figures, this blue figure, and there's a whole other bunch of things I could say about his relationship to more traditional forms of Algerian painting and art. The other person I wanted to talk about, just mention, is Hawad, sometimes known as Mahmoudan Hawad, who was born in 1950 and now lives in France, but he was born in Niger, who's Tuareg, who has done a lot of work, poetic work, and visual art work on the tests and like speaking from the position of the population of the Sahara and the local civilians who were affected, and who to this day, like not a single one of them has been compensated, even though there's a law offering recognition for victims and restitution. the largely nomadic, undocumented population of the Sahara in the regions most affected just don't have access to the forms of evidence or proof that they were there at the time and place, and so they can't actually their experience can't meet the evidentiary requirements of the French state's system for compensation and restitution. There are many other images of this, but Hawad's visual art, so there's the poetry, but then he does this work to illustrate his books of poetry and prose, and also does prints separately, and they're known as furigraphies that combine text, image, and memory. He creates this graphic work like the ones on the covers of these two texts, and while he's doing that, he's creating new concepts in the Tamazight language, which allows for the poetry, painting, calligraphy. He uses them in political manifestos. The creative work of Hoka and Hawad has garnered considerable critical and scholarly attention in Algeria, in France, and elsewhere. The two artists are the most well-known, perhaps, among a small group of Algerian and Saharan witnesses to the historical and political traumas of the colonial and nuclear era, who've expressed that history and recalled that history in these kinds of creative forms. But over the past several years, I've engaged in a lot of self-interrogation about my relationship to Algerian and Saharan victims working on a project like this, especially coming at it from a cultural historical perspective, my fascination with these things, but also my great distance from this space and these people and their experiences. And I've asked myself, like sometimes I've thought about abandoning it, sometimes I've thought about digging deeper or going further in response to that distance. And what role, if any, my work has to play in relationship to, or as a form of support for their claims, for victims' claims for justice and restitution. So the artists I want to talk about and kind of feature today, moving on from Hoka and Hawad, are actually non-Algerian artists and projects that have kind of come into being also at a distance from this history, and some of the thinking that's been going on for me is thinking about how I might learn from their practices, their creative practices, in terms of the work that I want to do as a historian, that I am doing as a historian. So I'm going to move now to showing you some and playing for you some examples of the work of these artists, to share a bit how it's helped me to think through. Sorry, it keeps doing this. The politics of working on these spaces and communities at a great distance for myself. And I won't push that further now, but we can come back to it later if anybody's interested in doing that. So the first artist I want to speak about, the first of my three cases, is Grégory d'Argent, who is a musician and a photographer who did a project called Ash, that is a combination of photographs that he did with argent, like silver photographic print technology and capturing photographs. But the real bulk of his work is as a musician, an improvisational musician who plays the oud and who collaborates often, regularly with North African musicians and is trained in Algeria and Morocco and elsewhere. Grégory is also the child of he's the heir to a long line of French military, French soldiers who served in Algeria, who his family is from Algeria, and his project to explore the French bomb in the Sahara and these detonations in the Sahara through photography and through music, he, in speaking to him in the interview that I did with him, he was very open about the fact that his work going to this place, trying to connect to these people and to this experience and to this history, is very much for him a work of reconciliation. So he's kind of a standout among the three, thinking about his own family's implications in this history, but then also thinking about how the music that he produces in collaboration with North African artists, using traditional instruments, how that music can enact a kind of a moment of reconciliation. And at one point he said, for me, the son and the grandson of French soldiers who lived in Algeria just up until the war, and I think his father left in 1962. He went to Algeria 60 years later to explore this history and to try to come to terms with his own family's relationship to that. So trying to think through that, think about that through music. I'm just going to play a little bit of the music. Feel free to close your eyes. This is a trailer for one of the performances, so it's got some things in it that the regular photographic exhibit and the performances, which are these improvisational gatherings where there's also audiovisual, like multimedia stuff going on in the background with archival images and film footage of the detonations. And I'll want to come back to Jonathyne's stuff. Like just listening to you talk was making me think about Gregory differently already, but I'll move on to my next example. So the second case I want to talk about is an Egyptian artist who's based in Berlin. Her name is Heba Amin. In what became part of a 2022 multimedia installation, this Berlin-based artist has spent a great amount of time thinking and working with a photograph that was taken that some of you have seen. I've talked about it before to some of you and written about it. A photograph that was taken during the preparation for Jerboise Rouge in December 1960. And Heba, who works in a kind of decolonial, anti-colonial mode, rethinking and reconstructing colonial technologies and interrogating media at the same time that she's interrogating the colonial past and present, came across this photograph, didn't have a particular familiarity with this French history, this French and Algerian history, but became really fascinated by this image in a way that lots of people do as soon as they see it. It's a very striking, provocative image of dummies, mannequins, stuffed clothing figures, propped up again by poles in the Sahara to be exposed to the detonation of that third bomb to check for the impact of the bomb on clothing and uniforms and that kind of thing. So this what Heba did, she became really fascinated by this photograph, and one of the things that she does in her work is to kind of recreate archival images, documents, texts, using other media, including like a real craft-based model. And I'll just show you instead of trying to describe this. Beginning with, she began with like military reenactor model creator uniforms, like the people who build like tiny Napoleons or whatever they do. She ordered all of these uniforms, and she actually made the decision to recreate these dolls in 3 dimensions. And so I'll just show it to you here. So she the original aim was to take the photograph again, but interested in that intersection between colonial and other technologies, and in particular the camera. So she was interested in like the nuclear detonation, but also how the camera served the nuclear detonation. And so her original project was to recreate the scene and to reshoot the photograph. That's her kind of process, to try to think through how such a photograph came to be, to think through what somebody like Ariella Azoulay would call like the event of photography and the photographic situation by recreating it in 3 dimensions. And then the original photograph is projected in front of this. These are about 30 centimeters tall. And talking with Heba, she had so much to say about how she thought that the recreation of these dolls, and it was like very painstaking work. She sewed the uniforms, she stuffed them, she figured out a way to kind of recreate the posts, that this would help her to understand and to humanize the scene and to humanize the situation of the detonations. But in fact, it took her in the exact opposite direction, that the more she did it, the more she felt like she was confronted with the kind of destructive and violence of the destruction and violence of the nuclear uncanny, like trying to build these dolls and try to even understand how this nuclear imperial situation came to be. The other form that this recreation took, this activation of the image took, was that she had them printed on these fabric screens so that one could walk through the gallery space and interact with the images in life size. Again, that image has been circulated so much and used so much, and so much has been said about it, and there's so much controversy about it, that inserting the viewer or the spectator or the visitor or the gallery visitor in the image and moving through it was sort of one of her aims there. So as I said, she originally intended to reproduce the photograph itself, recreating the figures and the scene in order to remake the image from scratch. And that kind of reconstruction was an important part of her process, but the process of rebuilding the image, made her further, like, question the image itself and the scene of the photograph in a new way, in provocative ways. I'm over time already? Oh, okay. I'll just show this last example and say a couple of thoughts about. So the last artists I want to talk about are Arwa Aburawa and Tarab Shah, artists and filmmakers who are based in London. Arwa is a Palestinian filmmaker, and her work explores race and nature. She also runs a community film program and film school as part of her work with Other Cinemas, a project she co-founded with Tarab, who's the cinematographer. I'm going to show you a brief clip from the film. The film was entirely shot, the film, and still it remains, was entirely shot in Mertutek, a village nestled in the Hogar Mountains in Algeria's southern Sahara, home to the Escamaran community of Black Algerians. And the Hogar was the site of all of the underground detonations between 1961 and 1966. And as I said, the communities in that surrounding area continue to suffer the consequences of radioactive fallout. And I just want to show a very brief clip from the film.
فرنسا هي اللي غادرة، يا فرنسا اللي راه دير بومات اللي تدير، هي اللي على بالها، احنا ما على بالنا بوالو. خسرت الزراعة، خسر الحيوان، خسروا السجون، خسر الوحش. بدأت الدنيا تمرض.
Okay. I will wrap it up just by saying, now that I've shown you these three examples, what my questions are and what questions I'd like to talk about with all of you, if that's possible, are all the things I'm grappling with around formal considerations of sound, image, moving and still, the question of perspective, proximity and distance from this history in these works, or the question of colonial residue, and what Jonathyne said earlier, that thinking about outside, inside, that idea of proximity and distance from this history. For D'Argent, it's family, personal reconciliation. For Amin, who's an Egyptian anti-colonial artist, and thinking through colonialism and technology, the French detonations afforded her this opportunity to work with the photograph and to revisit this history. And for Arwa and Tarab, Arwa, who's Palestinian, her relationship to these people and to thinking the question of settler colonialism in Algeria in relationship to her own people and history was really significant. So I'm trying to think through how to think these projects in terms of memorial culture, their relationship to political and intergovernmental conversations, and then also there's like the ethics and the aesthetics of like a transnational solidarity art project that brings together an Egyptian artist, a French artist, and a Palestinian artist thinking through these questions in an international frame. Thanks so much. Sorry for going over time.
I get mine.
Okay. Our final speaker this afternoon is Nikki Georgopulos. Nikki is Assistant Professor of Art History at the University of British Columbia. She's currently working on a monograph entitled A More Certain Truth, Realism, Truth, and Painting in the 19th Century, as well as a co-edited book project entitled Imagined Archives, Writing Speculative Art Histories. She was co-curator of the exhibition Paris 1874, The Impressionist Moment, at the Musée d'Orsay and currently the National Gallery in Washington. And she served as a curatorial consultant for Mary Cassatt at Work, an exhibition you can see across town at the Palace of the Legion of Honor after its first stop in Philadelphia. Her talk today is entitled National Identities and the Politics of Dislocation at the 1874 Exposition Alsacien-Lorrain. As you can see.
Yeah. Thank you. Just make sure it's all. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dan, and thanks so much for having me. It's so exciting to be here. Thanks to Jonathyne and Roxanne for their papers. And yeah, I'm a bit of a fish out of water in this conference and in this panel, but I think in a really exciting and generative way. I also want to just take a moment to acknowledge the incredible labor of my two undergraduate and now graduate research assistants that I've had the incredible pleasure of working with at UBC, Kate Haggerty, who is now a MA student at Boston University, and Allegra Stevenson-Kaplan, who is still at UBC. Okay. I want to start with a piece of art criticism from 1874, the year of the first Impressionist exhibition, which is celebrating its sesquicentennial this year. It starts out much the same as much period criticism, with bombastic praise. We have only one more chance to speak of this incomparable collection. It will soon be dispersed as the doors of the Palais de la Présidence will close on the 31st of this month. Let those who are late hurry. We cannot repeat it too often. We may never have such an opportunity again. Our critic, writing in the Journal des Débats, then swerves. It must not be forgotten that these masterpieces of art belong to about 400 people, and it took a forceful appeal to patriotism and charity to persuade these art lovers to part for a time with their riches, collected not only with a lot of money, but with the help of discernment, taste, intelligence, and jealous care. That we succeeded in momentarily removing such a quantity of rare and fragile objects from their galleries and cabinets is almost a miracle. But the names of Alsace and Lorraine are magical. They will forever resonate in the ears of the French public. The critic continues for paragraphs upon paragraphs, rhapsodizing about the treasures under his consideration, enumerating the A-listers of French society from whose collections they are drawn. His rhetoric of patriotism and charity and the resonance of Alsace-Lorraine and their magical effects upon the French public are woven throughout his column inches. Such leitmotifs refer not to the exhibition's subject or contents, but instead to its entire raison d'être, as the show under consideration was the Exposition en faveur des Alsaciens-Lorrain à profit de la colonisation de l'Algérie, hereafter, for all of our sakes, the Exposition des Alsaciens-Lorrain. And that's also how it was commonly referred to in the press. The exhibition, running from April through August 1874, was staged at the Palais Bourbon, which had served as the seat of the lower house of French Parliament and is still the seat, of course, today of the Assemblée Nationale. The exhibition's express purpose was to raise money in support of the relocation of recently displaced French citizens to colonized lands in Algeria. And I'm sure this crowd needs no reminding of the historical conditions that occasioned such an exhibition, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'll back up a little bit. Following the disastrously misled launch of the Franco-Prussian War in the summer of 1870 by Emperor Napoleon III, the French suffered a short but brutal battle, culminating in the siege of Paris the following winter and eventually the surrender in January of 1871. In the wake of the chaos and brutality of the Paris Commune and its suppression, the Treaty of Frankfurt was signed in May 1871, surrendering the province of Alsace and the department of Moselle, which was the largest in the region of Lorraine, to the Prussians. Per the terms of the treaty, residents of the annexed territories were presented with a difficult choice: to stay in their homes and become Prussian citizens, or to retain French nationality and leave their homelands. Some 130,000 left Alsace-Lorraine, losing their homes but gaining a national reputation as heroic refugees, a locus upon which much of the grief of the loss of the war was focused. The Orphelins d'Alsace, as they were called in the French press, received material support from the French government to fund their relocation. So too did a number of charitable organizations crop up around this time in order to raise private funds to this end. Perhaps the most prevalent of these groups was the Société de Protection des Alsaciens et des Lorrains demeurés français, which again I'll abbreviate to, for all of our sakes, to the Société de Protection. While most of the refugees resettled in nearby regions, another option for a new home was offered up by the freshly formed government of the Third Republic. In June of 1871, the National Assembly codified a resolution pledging 100,000 hectares, or about 400 square miles, of the best land to the patriotic population in the overseas territory of Algeria. So this was earmarked specifically for Alsace-Lorraine. Occupied by the French since 1830 and officially annexed as a colony in 1834, Algeria represented a stronghold of France's territorial holdings in North Africa, an occupation, of course, that would last until the War of Independence. For the early Third Republic, a fragile government trying to regain France's footing on both domestic and international stages, the continued conquest of Algeria represented not just territorial expansion, but a vector through which to project geopolitical strength in the wake of the humiliating loss to the Prussians. The relocation of Alsacien-Lorrain to Algeria thus fulfilled two goals at once: honoring their sacrifice and providing them a new home as a reward for their continued loyalty to France, and deepening the territorial and cultural hold on the Algerian colony. It was, however, an expensive endeavor. The government could promise the land, but the cost of relocation into what was, in the French view, undeveloped land, and I'll come back to this more in a moment, remained. In response to this underfunded crisis, the Société de Protection was formed in 1873 as what we would now recognize as an NGO, an ostensibly non-governmental, non-partisan organization with a charitable mission to raise funds and rally support for displaced Alsace-Lorrainiens, with the explicit goal, and this is from their charter, of the creation of population centers in Algeria on their behalf. Indeed, the organization's actions were overwhelmingly concerned with building what they called centers of colonization in their materials in Algeria, raising existing towns and displacing Algerian locals en masse. Two archival documents from the Société's papers bear this out. The first is a map, one of many, which was published in the 1873-74 annual report of the Société, colorfully illustrating the newly built town of Activism. Tidy rows of houses are abutted by a school, a public fountain, and larger townhouses. Streams cut through arable land and zones of plantation are demarcated in green. The map's header reads, "The village of Activism, province of Alger, created and populated in 1873 by the Société de Protection des Alsaciens-Lorrain," and it goes on to name the president of the Société, which was the Comte d'Aussonville, and detailing some of the plans for the village. The following page includes a variety of architectural plans for the houses in question, incorporating features like pitched roofs and stonework that subtly recall the half-timber homes traditional to Alsatian vernacular architecture. And this was actually quite common in Algeria in this time and region, in the north region, to have very Alsatian architecture for this very reason, to sort of make them feel more at home. Another document from 1875 tells the other side of the story, a half-deteriorated public advisement proclaiming the expropriation of the land needed for the building of the new settlement, giving notice that any, quote, sequestered former indigenous owners would have a period of 10 days to register their comments. This mishmash of adjectives, ancien, propriétaire, indigène, séquestré, at once elides and it reveals the unspoken truth about establishing such zones of population, namely that the lands were already populated by local communities who had been forcibly stripped of their property rights. The archives in this particular case do not lie. Hundreds of pages of correspondence, and I really could show you a multitude of images that I have, hundreds of pages of correspondence and official proclamations on the Société's letterhead detail the replacement of dozens of Algerian towns with French ones. And I want to recognize here that I'm building off of and relying on a wealth of research that has been done by historians of French and North African colonial and post-colonial eras, such as Yves Frey, Fabienne Fischer, Avner Offrath, Jennifer Sessions, Patricia Lorson, and many others. But my work as an art historian, as I see it, is to better understand the role that art and material culture played in directly funding these imperial endeavors. And before I delve more deeply into the eccentricities of this particular exhibition, I want to take a moment to reflect on the productive strangeness of giving this paper in the context of a panel on art and activism. This topic goes somewhat against the grain of how we typically conceive of art as activism. Taking critical root in the feminist and AIDS activist art movements of the 1970s and 80s, our concept of activist art tends to press against extant power structures, confronting and advocating in issue areas like climate crisis, nuclear proliferation, gender-based violence, mass incarceration, etc. This is certainly the art I wish to see in the world. But it's a nasty case of selection bias to overlook the ways in which art has been used as a means towards ends that we now generally agree are nefarious, unethical, and generally not in the best interest of humanity. While art can and must be a mode of resistance, for much of history, it also was and still remains, of course, a tool of the state, wielded in pursuit of expansionist aims. The Exposition des Alsacien-Lorrain was an attempt, and a successful one by almost all measures, by a government-aligned NGO to use art and its capital to imperialist ends, though it was marketed, of course, as a humanitarian response to a refugee crisis, so we're now more on like familiar liberal ground. I'm grateful for the opportunity to present this research in this seemingly ill-fitting context, as this discomfort has proved very generative for me. So, in the spring of 1874, a hungry art lover in Paris had a wealth of options to choose from. After perhaps taking in the first Impressionist exhibition or the Salon, or perhaps both if she's intrepid, she could make her way across the Seine, walking the length of the Pont de la Concorde before arriving before the soaring Corinthian columns of the Palais Bourbon. Built in the 18th century for the Duchess of Bourbon, the Seine-facing facade was constructed largely in the Napoleonic era, the pediment following in the late 1830s, early 1840s. And this has actually become one of the most interesting elements of this project for me, is thinking about the history of this building. The pediment was designed by Bernard Proyer and Jean-Pierre Cortot, and it is dominated by the central figure of Marianne, flanked by allegorical representations of strength and justice. The Republic, thus firmly on her mind, our would-be visitor would join a flow of people, pausing, of course, to pay her entrance fee, passing through the colonnade and into a rotunda adorned with Gobelin tapestries, such as this one, decorative vases, and other precious objects. She would then be directed into the Salle des Parts Perdus, a high-ceilinged room populated by 25 vitrines, bursting with enamel work, majolica, illuminated prayer books, medieval instruments, silver chalices, bronze clocks, ivory chests, and, as a cherry on top, a portrait bust of Michelangelo. Surely our visitor would have been dazzled by the buffet of colors, textures, and materials, the sunlight streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, catching on the precious gems and metals. This visual feast would only continue as she cast her gaze up to the ceiling to observe the fresco cycle painted by Horace Vernet, maybe focusing perhaps on the central image of peace against the backdrop of modern Paris. But as her gaze drifted down again, perhaps she would have noticed a cluster of racialized figures painted in trompe-l'oeil, one perched precariously, dizzyingly on a balustrade in identifiably Algerian dress. This would have been one of the few instances in which visitors to the exhibition would have seen any visual reference to the purpose of the grand event. Out of the 1,200 objects in the exhibition, and I have to say this is a very conservative estimate, it's probably closer to 3,000 objects, Merely a handful of them featured subject matter that would have reminded visitors even vaguely of their entry fare's destiny in a growing pot of funds intended for the relocation of displaced Alsace-Lorrainiens to Algeria. And these are just two examples of works in the exhibition that vaguely brought to mind the purpose of the exhibition. Instead, visitors were met with what can only be described as an embarrassment of riches, a sampling of the best that French art collectors had in their stores. My ongoing work on this exhibition includes using data visualization tools like heat maps and timelines to get a full picture of the breakdown in nationality, chronology, and subject matter of the hundreds of artworks and objects that were included in the exhibition. But for now, I just want to show you one piece of data that's an interesting to break down for the rough numbers of which. And this is really only representing the painters, I should say. So of the 270 painters approximately represented in the exhibition, so this is excluding sculptors, draftsmen, printmakers, etc., 20% were Italian, 21% were Dutch, and 43%, that's 116 artists, were French. Only 7 artists represented hailed from Germany, so it was apparently just a little too soon. So what can I, as a historian of art and culture, do with this information? Looking at this data, I'm struck by the preponderance of Dutch art of the 17th century, for instance, a period favored by collectors in this era, not only for its beauty and its domestic scale, but also, I would argue, for the long-standing sense of affiliation felt by the French in the 19th century with the Dutch Republic, associated as it was with a history of independence and revolutions calling for self-determination, not to mention empire. But more significantly, it is the exhibition in its totality, its ostentatious display of the riches of the French nation that crystallized into an image of national pride. This would have been especially poignant in the wake of another term of the Treaty of Frankfurt, the massive indemnity that the French were obligated to pay to the Prussians in the years following the war, a staggering 5 billion francs to be paid by March 1875. Otto von Bismarck openly acknowledged that this was intended to both humiliate the French and kneecap their economy. France being the richest country in Europe, he insisted, nothing could keep her quiet but to empty her pockets. From what this humble art historian can ascertain from attempting to read macroeconomics papers, the French economy proved surprisingly resilient in the wake of this payment, as the French undertook a large-scale push in building and public works programs, and even wages stayed relatively stable. The Exposition des Alsacien-Lorrain thus put on full and forceful display the continued wealth and refinement of the resilient nation, held in the city recently emptied of Prussian forces who had remained in place until the fulfillment of the indemnity in 1873. My study of this exhibition, which is still in its early stages, but in this study I want to conclude, let me start over. My study of this exhibition is still in its early stages, but I want to conclude today with some thoughts about why the Société de Protection would have chosen an exhibition as their first major fundraising effort. Though it would not become a tactic for them commonly, and that's likely because of a very high cost of staging such an exhibition, the Exposition aligns with a broader strategy undertaken by the French government and cultural sector at the time to project and engender a renewed sense of national pride and power. Within the larger artistic ecosystem of Paris in 1874, the Exposition des Alsacien-Lorrain was but one cultural project to articulate a message of national rebuilding in the wake of the wars of the preceding years. And there are quite a few other examples, but I won't take the time to enumerate them here. Unsurprisingly, the critical discourse surrounding the exhibition brimmed with patriotic rhetoric. A visitor's guide to the exhibition by Victor Fournel praised the generosity of the many lenders, there were 400 of whom, who heeded the call to, quote, pay a new debt to the homeland, la patrie, in aiding the work of a project that is, in Fournel's words, essentially national. His use of this term patrie, or homeland, acts as a hinge between the two geopolitical arms of this endeavor, gesturing at once to the lost territory of Alsace-Lorraine, as well as to the new frontier of French land in North Africa. A passing comment from another review just a few weeks following the exhibition's opening remarked that there was hardly anything more to say in praise of this admirable exhibition, concluding that all that there was left to do was to make an offering to those Frenchmen who will found a new homeland in Algeria. calling the exhibition Un Petit Louvre, Fournel puts his finger explicitly on how, in fact, the entire history of collecting is itself a material trace of imperialism. With unmasked amusement, he remarks in his closing paragraph that there is hardly an object in the exhibition whose backstory does not include the drama or comedy of conquest, in his language. He concludes by describing an ebony cabinet, which I'm still working on identifying, which was inlaid with lapis lazuli, mother of pearl, and ivory. All materials, of course, wrought from colonial and imperial trade or appropriation, writing with a touch of romance of how such objects arrived through their various peregrinations here in a governmental palace, for the greater benefit of our compatriots of Alsace. As many art historians before me have argued, art and its history was a nationalist project in the late 19th century, a means by which Frenchness could be articulated through both establishing a strong national aesthetic in contemporary art, as I would argue was going on across the Seine at the Salon and the Impressionist exhibition, but also by reinscribing French art into the broader lineage of European greatness and cultural achievement. My argument, to cut to the chase, is that this was precisely the goal and effect of the Exposition des Alsacien-Lorrain. Preliminary analysis of the trends in the major commentary on the Exposition reveals that the most critics focused on the big names of the show, and I'm just going to show you a few of the artworks that I've identified from the exhibition, many of which will be familiar to you. Raphael and Michelangelo, Jacob van Ruysdael and Hans Memling. These are just some of the art historical treasures that were named, but it was really among these the French works that took precedence for the critics. Vigée-Lebrun, David, Boucher, Chardin, Fragonard, all the greats of French painting, represented along its more contemporary defenders, Géricault, Ingres, Rousseau, Delacroix, Maisonnier, Decamps, and Gérôme. My point is this: in this little Louvre, 2 minutes, great, okay. In this little Louvre, this unprecedented exhibition of historical art, French art took its place in what Fournel calls a picture of art and civilization across 3 or 4 centuries. The exhibition represented an opportunity for the French to express their continued position of cultural supremacy, a defiant flag planted in the ground after the humiliation of the previous years. No longer the pitiable victims, they were reclaiming their international image, and doing so through the means by which empires that had preceded them had done for hundreds of years, through cultural achievement, and of course by planting that very flag in another's soil. The colonial occupation of Algeria was decades underway by 1874, but the resurgence of building and emigration of French citizens, abetted by the forceful eviction and subjugation of local populations in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, was more than a case of expediency. Not merely a solution for a refugee crisis, it was a means by which the loss of land could be assuaged by the gain of more, an assertion of domination that sent a message to the world of the ever-expanding patrie of France. The Exposition des Alsaciens-Lorrain played but a minor role in these endeavors, but one that allowed everyday Parisians to do their part, all within the hallowed halls of a building that represented the promise of the new republic. As Fournel's guide assures its readers in its final lines, a visitor to the exhibition would not be disappointed. He will never find a more pleasant and more useful opportunity to do a good deed. Thanks. Thanks for the clicker.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for questions, and the floor is open.
Yeah, you can turn it back on.
Terribly intellectual, but did people from Alsace-Lorrain have any interest in colonizing Algeria?
That's a great question. Yeah, so a lot was made of this, and what's really interesting is that and Fabienne Fischer, who published her dissertation on this topic of the emigration of Alsatians, particularly to Algeria, it was a sort of a trend, to use that, if I could use that word, that started as early as 1831. But what's interesting is that there was all of this press about how this was going to be the big, the big solution. But her study really showed that actually the rate of emigration really did not increase at all. So I think. Exactly, and most of them just like settled very nearby and then moved back. So only, I think, like there are really varying estimates that I've read, I think, but at most like 5,000 people moved in the immediate years.
And the irony, of course, of pushing them out of their homes while they're, the idea of pushing other people.
Yes,
I'm sorry,
exactly. But what's so interesting is that like this huge infrastructure is built to receive all of these people, and like there are photographs of these like very oddly Alsatian buildings, and I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time in Alsace, and so I can really it's very immediately recognizable, and even like the Alsatian stork, the cigogne, which is the symbol of Alsace, is everywhere. And Ifre published this great map of northern Algeria where all of the towns have these distinctly Alsatian names, like in Alsatian dialect. So it's very strange, but yeah, so it's like it was way overhyped essentially.
Somebody else?
I can ask a question to Nikki. Let's see. I wonder if there are any links you can make to the loss of the Mexican Empire in 1867. Also, because in this period, I'm not familiar with the colonization of Algeria or Mexico, but I generally understand that the public in France didn't necessarily care for colonization. So then it seems like this whole thing about art and resettlement of Alsacien-Lorrainians, providing more justification for colonization. Again, what was kind of the public reception? So these are two separate questions. And then I also have a question to Roxanne about that photograph. You said that everybody immediately gets really struck. I was really struck by this photograph because the stuffed figures, they looked like giants with the huge sky and things like that. So it's just a question about kind of partly about aesthetics and what draw us and artists to this photographs is partly very frightening, but it was partly just really striking, and how that relate to those exhibitions. Yeah.
I can answer mine very quickly, which is to say I'm not quite sure, because I think, of course you're right that especially in the case of Mexico, there was a great ambivalence on the part of the French, but I think my sense is that the loss of the Franco-Prussian War created this vacuum into which there was a need to sort of express geopolitical strength, and so maybe there was a sort of shift in rhetoric and sort of like national temperament, because there was a lot of the celebration of colonization in the case of Algeria, and for the sake of the Alsacien-Lorrain, it was very fervent and very open. And I'm really only reading this through art criticism and then also through the documents of the Société. But so I don't know what the sort of general public reaction was, but this was an exhibition, at least, that was extremely well received. And so I'm not sure that sort of attitude of ambivalence against colonization would really hold water in the first, and maybe it was just in the first years of the Third Republic. It's a really good question though, so I appreciate it.
That photograph, yes. I think in all of the projects, actually, one of my struggles thinking about the artworks that have been generated about this history and memory is that they're quite beautiful, right? and the photograph, and I've a whole other piece on this photograph and why people love to use it, even when they some people think they're real people, and there's a whole other thing around that, and debates about that, and they're not real people, but some people think anyway. So there's that, but even people who don't, it's the favorite of the images that get used that aren't images of mushroom clouds or the scarring of the desert or whatever. So and it stands in for Algerian victims, even though there are actually photographs of workers and other local people who participated, but those photographs never get shown. So it's this photograph that's the focus, and Heba's choice of it makes sense to me because she was real interested in the kind of convergence of the technologies of like camera and photographic technology and the bomb, and these things there's a whole literature about how the camera and the bomb kind of make each other in the post-war period. But when I look at the work that she's done, or when I look at the original photograph, same as when I listen to Gregory's music, or when I watch Awa's film, which you just saw a sort of brief snippet of it, and I talked with Awa and Tarab about this, like what the value of making such a beautiful work about such an ugly history is, in like very bald terms, right? Beauty, ugly. I know we could talk about this, and one of the things that, at least in the film, the project was to show that this landscape, that this history, although it's marked this landscape indelibly, is a very tiny piece of the longer arc of these people and this place. And everything in the film, from like the width of the shots to the like long, slow tracks, to the like, to the quiet and stillness of it, to the dislocation between voice and image, like all of these things were very deliberate choices to like reenact and remind us of the colonial situation while centering the experience of these people who've been scarred and marked by this history, but their history is much longer than this, and they have a sense of place and time that, goes to the thousands of years, not to the 5 years of testing in their region. But yeah, these works are quite beautiful, and I don't always know what to do with. I mean, it's the aesthetic question, right? It's like making beauty in response to ugliness. I don't know what we do with them. But thank you for that question.
This one's for Jonathyne. I'm wondering what, and your answer might just be read the book, which is fine. But I'm thinking about your general perspective, or like the broader therapeutic community's perspective about these negotiations of space with the types of activism that you're talking about, because it does seem radically different from, say, 60s, 70s, someone like Maud Manoni doing the sorts of therapeutic practices that, like, say, get people into job training programs to integrate them in the community, or like the exact opposite, someone like Fernand Deligny, who's like creating separate spaces outside of the community to have a neurodivergent community on its own. And this seems to be like quite different. And I know even still there are people who have stakes in like those different camps. I wonder if how they see this, if they see it as troubling, if they see it as like those contradictions being resolved, or like something different, something new. Yeah.
Well, I think, by the way, Scott, thank you so much for this question. This is like, to talk to somebody about these things is like a dream come true. But I say that one of the things that happens, especially with the work done by Manoni, is this question of the exploitative nature of doing these things, right? Is it exploitative to integrate disabled people into a capitalist system that is just going to crush them, right? And Manoni, of course, had a very difficult relationship with this, and critics often pointed out this. And I think one of the other interesting parts about this is that while both Deligny and Manoni had this sort of openness, right, the idea of like open spaces, they were still at a distance from society, right? So the idea is that they were semi-closed off spaces, right? That could be permeated, but that there was a space sort of just for autistic people. And I think what this work by the Atelier is trying to do is to create something else, right? To actually put autistic people into social space through the same mechanisms that we all enter social space, right? So through interactions with all kinds of people, interestingly through things like social media, which is, I think there's whole bunches of stuff to be thought about there about autists and social media, and whether that is a form of therapy, because everything becomes a form of therapy in many ways, right? So I think that question of exploitation, are these young people who participate in this music, are they being exploited? Because there's no history, by the way, of exploitation in popular music. Like, it just doesn't exist, right? Artists are never exploited in popular music. So I think, to kind of get the question, there may be something there about that sort of tension of questioning the true autonomy of disabled people. But I think in these actions, they are rejecting that and saying, we are autonomous beings, we have our own sort of aesthetic creations, and we are choosing ourselves to do this, which in and of itself is becoming a political act, because that's not the norm that is accepted here. Thank you.
What is the best? I mean, as far as your research is concerned, what is the attitude of the Algerian government to the kind of the because I noticed that several of these artists are based in Europe, which is not surprising, but rather than draw conclusions, I thought I would ask that.
Well, it's why I mentioned the first two as kind of like, they're like the canon of, like, when people say art that deals with people go, Hoa, the Hoka, right? So I've come across these people and this work, but there's been, like, their projects tend to be, people interact with Kaigli's music because they want to go to a concert or something like that, and then they're interested in his story, and he performs all over, like in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa. But the other two, I think they really think of their projects as a kind of, like an attempt to establish like a European and broader international awareness. And I know that Arwa and Tarab, like, they filmed in Algeria surreptitiously. They have a great, crazy story about how they managed to do the filming, but they've never, like, they haven't taken the film back to Algeria yet. And so I think, so the government was definitely not aware that they were even making the project. And the same is true with Heba. Like, I don't think that work has gone back to those places. And that's what's, I guess, that question of like proximity and distance. Like, I think I feel not that I'm an artist, but I feel a certain kind of kinship in doing a project on this place and these people that are disconnected from me, trying to figure out why I'm doing that and what my purpose is. And these artists are kind of dealing with that in a way as well. Like,
I mean, there is, fairly recent a museum of contemporary Arab art in Algiers, a fairly recent image, and it would be interesting to see what their programs are, and how much opportunity there is for artists whose work is in any way political.
I mean, the photo that Hazel, was taking us back to, like, there are people in the Algerian government who believe that that's an image of people. So, like, it would be interesting to, like, I don't know if, I haven't talked to Heba about this, but, like, taking that show to Algeria, like, there are many Algerians who believe that that is an image of Algerian civilian victims, like living prisoners of war who were attached to these poles in the desert. And I have a whole other thing on that, but, like, so I think it's
believable.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing.
And so, like, I don't even know if she's even considered taking that work there. But as an Egyptian artist, like, she's part of this conversation that is about, seeing the nuclear detonations as part of a broader African kind of recolonization through nuclear technology. But yeah, she's mostly showing in the European context and disconnected from conversations between French and Algerians about this history. Yeah, it's an interesting question.
Okay, well, we're right at time. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.